This time it's Honda CX500 versus Moto Guzzi V50. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. For a couple of years in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to own a Moto Guzzi V50 and a Honda CX500 at the same time. So I think it's interesting to look back and ponder what are the differences between the two bikes, and which one is perhaps the best suited to whatever you might want to use it for, and which one overall was the winner in terms of how I felt about it, which of course when dealing with a motorcycle is all important. Are the CX500 and Moto Guzzi's V50. Here are two machines with essentially the same engine layout, but the way that Honda and Moto Guzzi have tackled the same basic design has produced two extraordinarily different machines. CX500 is something of a water-cooled monster, and it surprises some people to find that it's actually using overhead valves. It looks more modern, it looks completely different in its approach to the Moto Guzzi. What push rods it does have, the engine kicks out around 50 horsepower and will power you up to about 112 miles an hour or so. It's an 80 degree V-twin rather than a 90 degree V-twin, but still manages to stay very smooth, although there is some buzzing at higher speeds, and this does sort of make your thumb go asleep if you're riding on the motorway for long periods. Nevertheless, if you're going to undertake a long trip, the CX is the bike to have, particularly two-up. It's much larger than the Moto Guzzi, so accommodates two people with ease. It's a bike that you could easily fit luggage to and ride down to Europe, no problem at all. But it is pretty heavy. It's much the heavier of the two. Although handling isn't too bad, it is a little bit more top heavy and feels very different. The issue really is that manufacturing techniques of the day meant that to make the engine liquid cooled, the castings are much thicker than they would be today. All this adds up to a rather heavy lump of an engine, and the design layout of the engine is a very interesting one. The gearbox almost sits in the sump, which sort of reminds me of the old mini engines, if you remember those. One effect that this does have is with those straight cut gears, the engine has a very distinct whine as you pull away. Very unusually for Honda, this is a machine with a rare character all of its own. Honda historically seems to produce what people often think of as aseptic machines, bikes devoid of character. This is not the case at all with the CX. The mid-range punch is extremely good. Whack the throttle open at anything above 50 miles an hour and the thing surges away and feels like a much larger bike, and it will rev to surprisingly high levels for an overhead valve engine. Cornering on the later Eurosport models is surprisingly good. It doesn't wiggle quite as much as the old original twin shock bike did, but it's still not fantastic. This is not a lightweight machine after all. Nevertheless, it can handle twisty roads perfectly capably. The gearbox clicks in rather nicely, and like a lot of Hondas, it is quite notchy, but it does go in smoothly enough. It's not too difficult to use, and you don't get a lot of false neutrals. Overall, in terms of reliability, well, of course, early CXs did suffer some crankshaft failures. This was much publicised, but Honda quickly remedied the problem, and by the time the Eurosport came out, there were no such worries about the crankshaft. The camshaft, however, is a different matter, or more specifically the cam chain and its tensioner. This seems to be a real common fault with Hondas of this era, and indeed my own bike, after about 35,000 miles, did stretch that cam chain. If this had been the Moto Guzzi, this might not have been quite such a huge problem. The trouble is the unusual layout of the Honda, where the clutch is at the front, and then it transmits power through a gearbox at the side to the back of the engine, means that the cam chain sits right at the back of the engine. So you've got to pull the whole thing out and split the rear drive off to get at the cam chain. The bike is not great for working on because it's difficult to strip down because there are lots of plates and bolts all over the place. But it's not impossible, and the home mechanic can definitely restore one of these engines if he knows what he's doing. They're not that complex after all. This is not a 6-cylinder dual overhead cam engine. Another nice part of the design is the carburettors. These are sort of splayed in so they don't get in the way of your knees in the way that they might do on some larger Guzzis. A closer comparison to the CX would actually be a BMW R65 or R80, as these are much more similar weights. And against these bikes, the CX looks even better. It feels more refined and will definitely outcorner them. The Moto Guzzi V50 was my first, well, notionally big bike. I say notionally because it's a very small, light and compact little machine. And although 500cc's, it's considerably smaller than, say, a Honda CB250 Super Dream of the day. And not only is it more compact, it's also considerably lighter too, which is no small achievement because this is a shaft drive motorcycle after all. Of course, the two machines do sound vaguely similar, but there is something very different and very special about the little Guzzi. Being air-cooled, it's much more mechanically loud than the CX is. So in some ways it sounds a little bit less refined. Guzzi claim around 45 horsepower for the little V50, but I'd be surprised if it was actually that much. Perhaps somewhere in the late 30s is really nearer the truth. Nevertheless, the machine will top out at over a tonne and accelerates very briskly, largely due to that light weight. On Twisty Road, it easily showed a clean pair of heels to the CX, and those all-round disc brakes, particularly once I converted the cable-operated front, were excellent. In fact, they were very good on both bikes, but with less master slowdown, it was always easier to get the Guzzi to stop into corners. The Guzzi by comparison offered a completely different riding experience. It was much louder, much more visceral machine. You chucked it into corners and it just went wherever you pushed it. Lots and lots of fun on a twisty road. Far more so, I'd have to say, than the CX. The V50 doesn't really produce the same mid-range torque that the CX does. Not surprisingly, only running those two valves through a heaven head. But it does a pretty good job all the same, and as you get near the top end, it's a little bit of a rush and a little bit of excitement, and a change of exhaust note too. Of course, two up it isn't nearly as roomy, so if you're going for a long ride with a partner on board, it's probably not as good a choice as the CX. Having said that, I did ride all the way up to Scotland and around some areas of Scotland on my V50 without any difficulty at all. In fact, it was one of the most enjoyable trips that I've ever had. This was, of course, one up. In terms of reliability, early V50s in particular, the Mark I, as it's now called, gave quite a few mechanical issues. The Mark II had a major redesign, which included electronic ignition, although this wasn't really perfect and didn't work particularly well below 2000 RPM when there's a bit of a flat spot. Of the two bikes, the build quality on the CX is better than that of the Moto Guzzi. That probably doesn't surprise anybody. The paint is more luscious and certainly stands the course in terms of rust protection. Of course, both machines would sort of splutter out of production in the mid-80s. Military versions and police versions of the Moto Guzzi were available for a number of years after civilian production ended. In terms of variety and choice, well, for the CX, there was of course the standard model, the Eurosport which came along later, but also alongside these was a custom style bike, and of course a silver wing Grand Tourer. Similarly, the V50 was available in a couple of flavours. There was a standard road model, and of course a more sporty model, the V50 Monza, which had a touch more power and rather more aggressive looks. In terms of electrical equipment, well, that, as you would expect, would go to Honda. Very simple switchgear that's very reliable. So overall, which did I think was the best bike? For me, it would depend on what I was actually doing. If I was going on a long trip, particularly two up, it's got to be the CX500 every time. But if I'm going on a twisty road and I'm riding alone, it's the V50 every time. It's so much more nimble and it's so much more visceral. It has a sense of occasion that a CX simply can't match. So the big question is, if I had the choice and was offered both bikes back again, which one would I take? And it really wouldn't be a very difficult choice. As much as I love the CX, as much as it was an extraordinarily practical bike, the V50 just had an aura of excitement that the CX could never match. You see, sometimes character does win out. I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.